Number 10. The Dogu and Joman ritual practices. Some sacred practices survive through scripture or priestly testimony. Others survive only through objects, fragments, and the stubborn material trace of repeated behavior whose full meaning has long since withdrawn from language. The ritual world suggested by the Dogu figures and wider Joman ceremonial life belongs to that second category. It does not confront us with a lost religion we can neatly summarize. It confronts us with a pattern of sacred attention that remains visible in form, but only partially accessible in meaning. Across prehistoric Japan, especially during the Joman period, people produced distinctive clay figurines, now known as dogu. Many have striking bodies, exaggerated eyes, marked surfaces, and forms that feel anything but casual. Some appear broken intentionally. Others seem to emphasize fertility, the body, transformation, protection, or states of being that later viewers instinctively recognize as ritualized, even when they cannot fully say why. That intuition is important. These are not random artifacts. They feel made for charged use. That is what gives them their strange power. We are not looking at a text that tells us exactly what participants believed. We are looking at objects that seem to have moved through repeated ceremonial handling, deposition, breaking, and symbolic emphasis. The body is there, but stylized. The human form is present, but altered. This often signals a ritual logic in which the figurine is doing more than representing a person. It may be mediating illness, fertility, protection, transition, danger, or contact with forces that could not be approached directly. This is where the unease begins. History can describe the material culture of Joman ritual, the settlements, the figurines, the pottery, the deposits, the possible ceremonial contexts. But description is not possession. The real center remains partly hidden because ritual meaning is rarely stored in the object alone. It lives in gesture, sequence, taboo, spoken formula, bodily experience, and social expectation. Once those disappear, later ages inherit only the residue. The Dogu figures are powerful because they preserve evidence of attention without preserving the whole language of why that attention mattered. The possibility of intentional breakage deepens the mystery. In many ritual traditions, the breaking of an object is not destruction in the ordinary sense. It is activation, release, transfer, conclusion, or controlled sacrifice. If Dogu were sometimes made to be broken in a meaningful way, then we are looking at a sacred practice built around transformation rather than preservation. That matters, because it suggests a ritual imagination very different from the museum logic through which we now encounter the objects. What was sacred may not have been the intact figurine, but the act performed through it. The broader Joman world also adds depth. This was not a simple or spiritually empty prehistoric landscape. Settlements endured, material culture developed with extraordinary richness. Symbolic life seems to have been dense enough to generate distinctive visual traditions over long periods. In that context, the Dogu do not look like isolated oddities. They look like emissaries from a ritual universe whose structure was once fully legible to the people inside it and is now only visible in flashes. And that is why the Dogu and Joman ritual practices belong here. They show how sacred behavior can remain undeniably real while its inner logic slips just beyond reach. The figurines still look intentional, still look charged, still look as though they participated in ceremonies that mattered deeply. But history, left mostly with clay and context, can only circle the edge of that significance. The rites are gone. The pressure they left in the objects remains. Number 9. The Derveni Orphic Ritual Tradition. Some sacred practices are mysterious because they were secret. Others are mysterious because they survive through texts that explain just enough to reveal a world of ritual complexity, then stop short of giving us the full living experience. The Derveni Orphic tradition belongs to that second kind of mystery. It does not leave us in total darkness. It leaves us with firelight, fragments, interpretation, and the uneasy sense that we are overhearing sacred knowledge from outside the room where it actually mattered. The Divini Papyrus, discovered in a funerary context in northern Greece, is one of the oldest surviving manuscripts from Europe, and its survival alone would make it extraordinary. But what gives it special force is its content. A dense interpretive engagement with Orphic material, cosmology, divine order, ritual understanding, and the fate of the soul. This is not the language of simple public religion. It is the language of people who believed that sacred truth required decoding, that myth concealed deeper structure, and that ritual knowledge helped orient human beings within a universe charged with invisible consequence. That is what makes the Divini tradition so haunting. We are not merely dealing with belief in gods. We are dealing with the interpretive ritualization of belief, with a world in which sacred poetry, philosophical explanation, funerary concern, and initiatory or esoteric insight may all have overlapped. The text suggests a religious environment where words were not only recited, but mined for hidden meaning, and where the right understanding of divine narrative may have been tied to ritual correctness, purity, and the management of what happens after death. This is why the tradition still feels only partly grasped. The papyrus gives us voice, but not the whole ceremony. It gives us exegesis, but not the full performance. It shows us that there were people investing immense seriousness into Orphic cosmology and sacred interpretation, but it does not hand us the complete embodied rite in a form we can simply replay. The gap between text and living ritual is what keeps the mystery alive. We know enough to see that something spiritually sophisticated was happening. We do not know enough to feel we have entered its center. The funerary setting of the papyrus sharpens everything. Death is one of the strongest preservers of ritual seriousness, and when a text of this kind is connected to burial, purification, or post-mortem concern, the stakes become clearer. This was not speculative thought in the abstract. It was bound to human passage, to the fear that death required preparation, and to the hope that sacred knowledge might protect, guide, or transform the soul beyond the visible world. That always intensifies ritual meaning, because it pushes belief toward necessity. The Orphic dimension matters too. Orphic traditions have long occupied an ambiguous place in the study of Greek religion, not wholly outside the mainstream, yet never reducible to simple civic practice either. They often seem more concerned with purification, hidden meaning, divine origins, and post-mortem destiny than the ordinary public cult image of Greek religion suggests. The Divini material supports that impression without fully resolving it. It confirms depth, but preserves ambiguity. And that is why the Divini Orphic ritual tradition belongs on this list. It reveals a sacred world in which ceremony, interpretation, myth, and the soul's fate were bound together tightly enough to produce ritual seriousness of a very high order. But it survives in the form most likely to keep later generations slightly outside it. Fragments of wisdom, echoes of rite, and a text that feels like both a revelation and a barrier. We can see the outline of the sacred logic. The full inner fire that animated it still flickers beyond the page. Number 8. The Aztec New Fire Ceremony. Some rituals were designed to honor the gods. Others were designed to prevent the world from ending. The Aztec New Fire Ceremony belongs to that second category, and that is what gives it such terrifying force. This was not a festival in the shallow sense. It was a cosmic emergency made ritual. In the Aztec world, time was not simply a neutral sequence of days. It was charged, unstable, and bound to cycles that carried real danger. Every 52 years, the ritual calendars aligned in a moment that was understood not as completion alone, but as risk. The cycle could renew or it could fail. If it failed, the sun might not rise again, the cosmic order might break, and the world itself could fall into darkness. That belief gave the new fire ceremony its extraordinary intensity. It was not merely commemorative, it was preventative. That is what makes the rite so difficult for modern minds to absorb fully. We can describe the steps. Fires were extinguished, darkness spread, priests ascended to perform the central act. A sacrificial body became the site through which new flame was kindled. Then the fire was carried outward to relight the world. The gestures are visible enough in the historical record to reconstruct in outline, but the inner emotional reality is harder to recover. To participate in such a rite was not just to watch symbolism, it was to stand inside a civilization-wide confrontation with cosmic insecurity. The extinguishing of all fires matters especially. Rituals often transform space. This one transformed the entire social world by suspending ordinary continuity. Domestic flame, temple flame, civic light, everything had to go dark, so renewal could happen from a single point of sacred recreation. That is an astonishing act of ritual totality. It meant that every household, every community, and every political center was made dependent on one successful ceremonial passage. Religion here was not separate from civilization. It was civilization's mechanism for restarting itself. The sacrificial dimension deepens the mystery rather than simplifying it. Modern audiences may focus immediately on blood and recoil, but if we stop there, we miss the deeper ritual logic. In the Aztec sacred imagination, sacrifice was not random cruelty. It was participation in cosmic maintenance, an answer to a universe already structured through exchange, danger, and obligation. That does not make it less severe. It makes it harder to dismiss. The New Fire Ceremony reveals a worldview in which life, order, and light themselves were thought to depend on correctly enacted sacred payment. This is why the rite remains only partly understood even when its broad framework is known. We can identify the calendrical logic. We can name the fear of cosmic interruption. We can reconstruct the drama of extinguished fires and renewed flame. But we still remain partly outside the interior certainty that made such a ceremony necessary. To the people inside it, this was not metaphor. The danger was real enough to reorganize the entire society for one night around the possibility that dawn itself might fail. And that is why the Aztec New Fire Ceremony belongs here. It survives as one of the most powerful examples of ritual acting, not as symbolic ornament, but as a civilization's direct attempt to intervene in the survival of the cosmos. The ceremony is historically visible, structurally intelligible, and emotionally still difficult to enter. We know what happened. We do not fully know what it felt like to live in a world where the fire had to be made new, or everything might stop. Number 7. The Norse Seiðr Ritual Tradition. Some sacred practices are mysterious because they were hidden underground or sealed inside temples. Seiðr remains mysterious because it survives through fragments, accusations, poetry, later prose, and cultural discomfort, leaving us with the strong impression of a powerful ritual tradition whose full performance world has mostly slipped away. In Norse tradition, Seiðr appears as a form of magic or ritual practice associated with prophecy, fate-working, altered states, and the manipulation of forces not ordinarily open to human control. It is linked especially, though not exclusively, with female practitioners, with figures such as the vulva, and with a sacred role that seems to have involved vision, chanting, ceremonial equipment, and some kind of transformed or elevated mental state. Even in the surviving sources, Seiðr does not feel like ordinary religious performance. It feels charged, dangerous, and socially unstable. That instability is part of what makes it so fascinating. The tradition appears to have carried both power and stigma. Men associated with Seiðr could be accused of unmanliness or moral violation, suggesting that the practice crossed boundaries the culture itself found difficult to contain. That tension is one of the strongest clues we have. Rituals attract stigma when they touch zones of power that society wants but cannot absorb without anxiety. Seiðr seems to have belonged to exactly that category. It promised access to hidden knowledge and influence, but at the cost of crossing into ambiguous terrain. This is why the practice remains so elusive. We have descriptions, but they are often late, literary, or filtered through Christian scribes looking back on pagan material from a different worldview. We have hints of staffs, platforms, songs, attendants, invocations, trance-like states and prophecies delivered from altered positions of authority. But hints are not the same as a fully preserved rite. What later texts preserve may be memory, caricature, survival, or reinterpretation all at once. The result is a ritual tradition we can perceive strongly without being able to stabilize completely. The association with prophecy and fate deepens the unease. In many traditions, divination remains bounded by acceptable sacred offices. Seiðr seems more volatile than that. It may have involved not only seeing what was coming, but influencing outcomes, binding luck, affecting minds, or working through forms of ritual presence that later audiences struggled to describe without moral anxiety. That makes it more than fortune-telling. It suggests a sacred technology of contact with hidden order, one that was socially powerful precisely because it blurred the line between religious insight and dangerous manipulation. The role of voice and performance also seems crucial. Accounts connected to practices like these often emphasize chant, speech, and orchestrated atmosphere. That matters because ritual power in oral cultures is never just about belief in abstraction. It is embodied through sound, repetition, posture, and the created environment of the rite. If Seiðr depended heavily on those elements, then its disappearance into text form would leave us with exactly the kind of residue that history finds hardest to fully recover. We would know it mattered, but not completely know how the room changed when it began. And that is why the Norse Seiðr tradition belongs on this list. It is not wholly lost, but neither is it truly transparent. It survives in a charged half-light, visible enough to show us that prophecy, trance, gender tension, and ritual authority once formed a potent sacred complex in the Norse world, yet veiled enough that the living center of the practice still feels just beyond reach. We can name it, we can glimpse its outline, but the full force of what Seiðr was and what it felt like when the practitioner entered that altered sacred role remains one of the North's most enduring ritual shadows. Number 6. The Minoan bull-leaping ceremonies. Some sacred practices survive in words, others survive in images so vivid that they feel as though they should explain themselves. Yet the more closely we study them, the more their true meaning seems to slip away. The Minoan bull-leaping ceremonies belong to that second category. We can see them, at least in artistic form. We can feel their movement, danger, and choreography. But the inner logic of what they meant remains one of the most tantalizing ritual uncertainties of the ancient Mediterranean. From Bronze Age Crete, especially through frescoes and related imagery, we inherit scenes of human figures interacting with bulls in ways that seem neither ordinary sport nor simple sacrifice. Bodies are shown vaulting over the animal's back, grasping horns, or moving through sequences that suggest deliberate performance rather than chaotic struggle. The images are elegant, stylized, and charged with energy. They do not depict random contact with a dangerous beast. They depict something formal enough to be remembered visually. That is what makes the practice so haunting. Bulls in the ancient world already carried enormous symbolic weight: strength, fertility, kingship, storm power, sacrifice, danger, masculine force, divine association. Once a culture begins building ritual around such an animal, the act can rarely be reduced to entertainment alone. The leap, if it was truly performed in anything like the way later imagination understands it, would have been more than athletic daring. It would have been a controlled encounter with power embodied. This is where the mystery begins. Were these ceremonies initiatory, elite spectacle, religious offerings enacted through performance rather than slaughter, symbolic mastery over wild force, choreographed rituals tied to seasonal renewal, divine presence, or social status. The evidence points strongly towards significance, but significance is not the same as certainty. What survives most clearly is the shell of the act, the bull, the body, the leap, the danger, the grace. What remains partly missing is the sentence those elements once formed together. The Minoan setting intensifies the uncertainty. Bronze Age Crete already presents itself as a world of palaces, storage systems, maritime reach, vibrant imagery, and symbolic forms that often feel richly ceremonial without becoming fully transparent. We know enough to see that ritual mattered deeply. We do not know enough to make every ritual image sit still. Bull leaping is therefore unsettling in the best archaeological sense. It looks too deliberate to be dismissed, too repeated to be accidental, and too symbolically loaded to be treated as mere acrobatics, yet still not fully explained by any one theory. The body itself matters here. Many ancient religions involve sacrifice, procession, prayer, or offering. Bull leaping, by contrast, appears to make risk into ceremony. If participants really placed themselves in close, stylized contact with a charging or active bull, then ritual was being enacted through physical danger. That changes the emotional register entirely. A sacred act involving peril always suggests transformation, proving, crossing, surviving, being remade by the encounter. Even if the artistic record idealizes what happened, it still points toward a ritual imagination in which human bodies were used to stage a confrontation with force. And that is why the Minoan bull-leaping ceremonies belong here. They survive as one of the most unforgettable images of ancient sacred life, a ritual form that feels too dangerous to be casual, too beautiful to be merely brutal, and too symbolically loaded to have been simple sport. We can still see the leap. What we cannot fully recover is the invisible thing participants believed they were touching when they made it. Number 5, the Siberian Scythian Kurgan burial rites. Some sacred practices remain mysterious because they were secret. Others remain mysterious because they were buried with such extraordinary care that later generations can recover the objects, the bodies, even the staging, and still feel that the central emotional force of the ritual has only been partly translated. The Siberian Scythian Kurgan burial rites belong to that second kind of mystery. Across the steppe world, and especially in the frozen contexts of Siberian Scythian burials, Kurgans have yielded some of the most astonishing funerary evidence from the ancient world. Preserved by cold and sealed beneath mounds, these burials reveal not simple disposal of the dead, but ceremonial worlds built around rank, mobility, sacrifice, adornment, and passage into another order of existence. Horses appear, weapons appear, textiles, tattoos, ornaments, vehicles, attendants, and carefully staged grave structures appear. Death here was not treated as a biological event alone. It was managed as transition with enormous social and sacred seriousness. That is what gives these rites their unsettling force. A burial becomes far more than burial when the dead are accompanied by whole systems of prestige and motion. The inclusion of horses is especially revealing. These were not random possessions tucked into graves. They suggest that the dead person's relationship to power, travel, identity, and perhaps afterlife movement remained active beyond death. The grave was being furnished not for memory alone, but for continuity under altered conditions. This is why the Kurgans still feel only partly understood. Archaeology can recover arrangement, materials, sacrifice, clothing, and rank display. It can tell us a great deal about status and funerary care. But ritual never lives only in inventory. It lives in sequence, chant, gesture, taboo, fear, and the collective mental universe that makes those objects necessary. When horses are killed and placed with the dead, when bodies are adorned with such intensity, when grave architecture is treated with this much symbolic investment, we are clearly dealing with a sacred logic deeper than prestige display alone. The problem is that the full theology behind that logic is not preserved in a single readable script. The preserved bodies intensify everything. In some cases, the dead still appear with astonishing immediacy, tattoos on skin, hair, clothing, flesh held in uncanny suspension by ice. That kind of preservation can mislead us into thinking we are close to full knowledge. In reality, we are close to the body, not necessarily to the meaning. The Kurgans remind us that even near-perfect material survival cannot fully restore the lost interior world of a rite. We may recover the dead person's outer preparation while remaining partly outside the belief that made such preparation essential. The Scythian context adds another layer. These were mobile, martial, horse-centered societies, often seen by settled civilizations as peripheral, threatening, or hard to fully grasp. Later written accounts, when they exist, come partly through outsiders. That always complicates ritual understanding. The people who built the Kurgans knew exactly what these funerary acts were doing. Many of the clearest surviving descriptions come from others looking inward, often through admiration, fear, or distortion. As a result, the burials remain richly visible but not completely self-explaining. And that is why the Siberian Scythian Kurgan burial rites stand this high on the list. They reveal a funerary religion of extraordinary material intensity, one that organized death through animals, adornment, sacrifice, preserved identity, and a grave world that feels prepared for continuation rather than mere remembrance. The mounds have opened, the objects have returned to light. Yet the deeper sacred certainty that once joined horse, body, and burial into one coherent act still lies partly beneath the ice. Number 4. The Maya Sacred Cenote Offerings at Chichen Itza. Some sacred practices remain mysterious because they happened in hidden chambers. The rites surrounding the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza remain mysterious because they were performed in full contact with one of the most unsettling ritual spaces imaginable, a deep natural well that did not simply receive offerings, but seemed to swallow them into another world. At Chichen Itza, the sacred cenote was not just a water source. It was a portal in religious imagination, a place where the living could send gifts, petitions, and perhaps human lives into a realm connected with divine powers, rain, fertility, and the dangerous reciprocity between human communities and the forces sustaining them. Archaeology has recovered gold, jade, incense, textiles, bones, and other materials from the cenote, proving beyond doubt that this was not accidental deposition. The descent into the water was ceremonial, repeated, and meaningful. That is what gives the site its extraordinary charge. A temple can be entered and exited. A cenote, especially one treated as sacred, becomes a vertical threshold. Once offerings are cast into it, they are not simply stored. They are surrendered. The act is more final, more directional, and more cosmological. What goes down does not belong to ordinary human exchange anymore. It enters the deep. This is why the ritual practice remains only partly understood even when the basic outlines are clear. We know the cenote mattered. We know valuable offerings and human remains entered it. We know rain, agricultural survival, and the sacred landscape of Maya religion formed part of the context. But knowing this does not give us full access to the inner experience of the rite. Were these acts understood as negotiation, repayment, feeding divine forces, opening communication, or stabilizing a cosmic relationship that could otherwise turn lethal? Likely some combination, but the full emotional grammar remains difficult to restore. The presence of human sacrifice, or at minimum human deposition in ritual context, deepens the uncertainty. Modern language can identify violence quickly, but ritual meaning does not reduce so easily to condemnation alone. In the sacred logic of many ancient societies, sacrifice was not random cruelty. It was structured offering under conditions where the gods, ancestors, or elemental powers were believed to sustain life only through exchange. That does not make the rite less severe. It makes it more difficult because it reveals a worldview in which beauty, terror, necessity, and devotion could all converge in the same act. The cenote's natural form is crucial too. This was not an artificial altar built from human geometry alone. It was a feature of the landscape made ritually central. That means sacred practice here grew through collaboration between human intention and a place already charged by depth, darkness, water, and disappearance. The Maya did not merely build the ritual. They located it inside a natural opening that already felt like an answer to religious imagination. The earth itself provided the mouth. And that is why the Sacred Cenote Offerings belong on this list. The archaeology is real, the objects are real, the ritual seriousness is undeniable, and yet the full spiritual meaning remains partly submerged with the offerings themselves. We can recover what was thrown into the well. We cannot completely recover what the people standing at its rim believed the depths were giving back. Number 3. The Oracle Rites of Delphi. Some sacred practices survive through monuments. Others survive through words that once changed kingdoms, sent armies marching, restrained rulers, and shaped the choices of entire civilizations, even though the exact mechanism by which those words emerged still remains deeply unsettled. The Oracle Rites of Delphi belong to that second category. At Delphi, the sanctuary of Apollo became one of the most authoritative sacred centers in the ancient Mediterranean. Cities, kings, colonists, lawmakers, generals, and pilgrims came seeking divine guidance from the Pythia, the priestess whose pronouncements were believed to channel the god. On the surface, the basic structure is familiar enough. Sacred precinct, priestly order, ritual purity, question-answer. But that familiarity hides the deeper strangeness. The heart of the rite was not simply consultation. It was controlled access to inspired utterance, a moment when divine speech was expected to break into human affairs through one consecrated body. That is what gives Delphi its enduring power. We know the oracle mattered beyond dispute. Entire political and military decisions were shaped by its answers. Offerings poured into the sanctuary. The site's prestige lasted for centuries, yet the inner process remains difficult to pin down. How exactly did the Pythia enter the state from which her words emerged? Was trance induced through fumes, fasting, ritual preparation, environmental factors, psychological expectation, sacred performance, or some combination of all of these? The debate itself reveals the deeper truth. The rite was real enough to influence history, but elusive enough that even modern analysis cannot fully flatten it into one stable mechanism. This is why Delphi feels so haunting. A rite becomes especially mysterious when its social effects are visible on a vast scale, but its core experience remains partly hidden. We can reconstruct the sanctuary's layout, the political significance, the questions asked, the later literary record, and parts of the ceremonial framework. Yet the decisive moment when a human voice became divine counsel in the minds of those present still sits behind a veil. History knows what the oracle did in the world. It does not fully possess how the rite felt from inside. Ambiguity was part of the power. Delphic responses were often remembered as layered, conditional, or susceptible to more than one reading. That does not mean the rite failed. On the contrary, it reveals something central about sacred speech. The oracle's authority may have depended not on mechanical clarity, but on giving words capable of surviving interpretation, words that tied divine mystery to political reality without reducing either one completely. In that sense, the ritual was not just about accessing truth. It was about staging contact with a truth too dangerous or too complex to arrive in plain speech. The setting of Delphi intensified everything. Perched on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, charged with sacred geography, treasuries, monuments, and centuries of accumulated reverence, the sanctuary already functioned as a place where the world came to ask what it could not answer alone. Ritual efficacy is never only about the central performer. It is also about the architecture of expectation built around them. At Delphi, that architecture was immense, and that is why the Oracle Rites of Delphi stand this high on the list. They show us a sacred practice whose results undeniably shaped history, while its central moment remains partly shielded by time, reverence, and interpretive uncertainty. The rite worked, in the sense that entire cultures believed it worked and acted accordingly. But the exact inner process by which Apollo's voice was thought to enter the human world still remains one of the ancient Mediterranean's most enduring sacred enigmas. Number 2. The Roman Taurobolium. Some sacred practices remain mysterious because they were hidden from outsiders. The Roman Taurobolium remains mysterious because it was public enough to be known, dramatic enough to be remembered, and yet still elusive at its center, as though later generations inherited the image of the rite more clearly than the spiritual experience that made the image meaningful. Associated especially with the cult of Magna Mater, and in some later contexts, with related currents of Roman religious life, the Taurobolium has long been imagined as one of antiquity's most intense ceremonies. At its most famous in later memory, the rite involved a bull, an elevated platform or grating, and a participant positioned below, receiving the sacrificial blood. Whether every later description preserves the practice accurately in all periods is part of the problem. The ritual is visible enough to shock, but unstable enough in the sources that the exact form, symbolism, and transformation it was meant to produce remain debated. That is what gives the Taurobolium its enduring power. It confronts us with a rite that seems to promise rebirth through contact with sacrificial life, but the meaning of that rebirth is difficult to pin down. Was it purification, renewal, initiation into a closer bond with the divine, a dramatic public declaration of sacred status, a rite of cosmic restoration enacted through blood and animal force? The evidence suggests all of these possibilities brushing against one another without collapsing into a single calm answer. The bull itself matters enormously. In Mediterranean religion, bulls were never neutral creatures. They carried weight, virility, cost, danger, prestige, and sacrificial potency. To build a rite around such an animal and around the descent of its blood onto the human participant was to stage a violent encounter with life power at its most concentrated. This was not simply offering from a distance, it was proximity. The participant was not merely watching a sacrifice, the participant was placed within it. This is why the rite still feels only partly understood even when the broad outline is recognizable. Modern people can easily seize on the spectacle and stop there, reducing the Taurobolium to shock value. But rituals that survive for long do not survive on shock alone. They survive because they answer deep religious needs in a language participants find convincing. If blood was central, then blood must have meant more than gore. It must have signified transfer, renewal, sanctification, survival, or divine contact in a way that those inside the rite could feel as real. The Roman religious environment deepens the ambiguity rather than resolving it. This was a world capable of absorbing local cults, imperial politics, ecstatic devotion, solemn state forms, and personal salvation currents into overlapping sacred landscapes. The Taurobolium emerged within that complexity. That means it may have meant slightly different things in different settings, or evolved over time, or been interpreted through layers of public display and inner transformation that later readers tend to separate too neatly. And that is why the Roman Taurobolium belongs here. It is a ritual we can picture vividly without being able to possess completely. We see the bull, the blood, the initiate, the architecture of contact. But the deepest thing the rite was doing, the exact spiritual change participants believed the act accomplished, still remains partly hidden behind the violence of the image. History kept the shell. The sacred interior remains stained, present, and not fully clear. Number 1. The Eleusinian Mysteries. Some sacred practices are mysterious because the evidence is scarce. The Eleusinian Mysteries stand at number 1 because the evidence is abundant enough to prove their importance beyond dispute, yet disciplined silence, sacred secrecy, and the nature of the rite itself have kept the core experience beyond full recovery. Few ceremonies in ancient history were so famous, so influential, and so deliberately protected from explanation. For centuries, initiates travelled to Eleusis near Athens to take part in rites centred on Demeter, Persephone, descent, return, loss, fertility, and the promise that human death was not the end of meaning. This alone would make the mysteries important, but their power went far beyond seasonal myth. Ancient testimony repeatedly suggests that those initiated did not simply learn a doctrine. They underwent something, an encounter, a revelation, a sequence of acts and sights so transformative that many later writers could only speak around it, insisting on its gravity while refusing to expose its contents. That is what makes Eleusis so uniquely haunting. This was not a fringe cult hidden at the edges of the ancient world. It was one of the great religious institutions of Greek civilization, attracting participants across class lines and surviving for centuries because it answered a need ordinary public religion did not fully satisfy. Sacrifice, prayer, and civic worship were everywhere in Greek life. The mysteries offered something deeper, more inward, more existential. They seem to have addressed the fate of the soul, the terror of death, and the longing for blessedness through ritual experience rather than public theology alone. The mythology at the center gives us the outer structure. Persephone descends and returns. Demeter mourns and restores. Grain, loss, barrenness, search, revelation, and renewal all provide the symbolic frame. But the frame is not the rite. The real mystery lies in how this myth was embodied through procession, fasting, sacred objects, spoken formulae, perhaps a dramatic unveiling, perhaps a climactic vision, perhaps substances or atmospheres that altered perception, and certainly a collective movement toward a final moment initiates regarded as life-changing. This is why Eleusis remains only partly understood no matter how much scholarship gathers around it. The rites were protected by taboos so strong that even in a culture overflowing with words, the center held. Ancient authors hinted, alluded, praised, and feared disclosure, but comparatively few simply described the decisive act plainly. That alone tells us something vital. The mysteries were not considered powerful because of a secret proposition one could summarize in a sentence. They were powerful because the experience itself, seen, heard, felt, and endured in sequence, carried the meaning. The setting intensified everything. Processions from Athens to Eleusis, the telesterion, the sacred architecture built to receive initiates, the timing of the rites, the collective movement from ordinary daylight religion into guarded nocturnal revelation. All of it suggests that the mysteries were carefully designed to transform consciousness through rhythm and expectation. This was religion as passage, not merely instruction. And that is why the Eleusinian mysteries stand at number one. History knows they mattered, it knows they endured, it knows they shaped how countless people in the ancient world thought about suffering, harvest, descent, return, and death. But the central revelation, the thing seen or enacted that made initiates believe they had crossed into a deeper understanding of existence, remains partly sealed by the success of the rite's own secrecy. That is the final irony of Eleusis. The ceremony was meant to change lives, and it did. It became one of the best-known sacred institutions of the ancient world, and yet its heart survived precisely because it was never meant to be turned fully into ordinary language. We can approach the threshold. We can name the gods, the myth, the processions, the silence, the promise. But the innermost moment still stands where it always stood, just beyond the point where history can clearly speak.